You are listening to the Innovating Cannabis podcast, where you will meet entrepreneurs, cultivators, scientists, doctors, and inventors in the cannabis industry.
I'm your host, Pam Schmiel. In addition to producing and hosting this podcast, I'm a content writer and journalist. You can find links to my work in the show notes along with my contact information. Today, our guest is Alec Dixon. He's a lead judge for the Emerald Cup and co-founder of SC Testing Labs in California, Michigan, Arizona, and Colorado. For 15 years, SC Lab has tested hundreds of thousands of strains of cannabis and hemp and learned a tremendous amount about the averages versus potentials on how the plant expresses itself. He shares his insights into the characteristics of Emerald Cup winning strains and what is needed to take cannabis cultivation and products to the next level and what makes quality cannabis. Alec believes the craft industry is in danger of survival without the attention to the preservation of terpenes and minor compounds through a continuous cold supply chain of custody. Lots to discuss. Let's welcome Alec Dixon to the show.
These new white papers from abstracts about all the, they're saying they have now scientific proof that these minor metabolites, the esters, aldehyde, whatever all those are, and the sulfurs that they're coining cannasulfurs are really responsible for the aroma.
Well, they're majorly contributive.
Okay, major,
Yeah.
that's probably a better word, majorly contributing.
Well, they can contribute in substantial ways to the nuanced flavors and aromas, right? Because terpenes are the most present aromatics that are there in the greatest amounts relative to the other aromatics. And the terpenes themselves, when they're there in the substantial amounts that can be present within the cannabis plant, are the major things behind the contribution to the entourage effect and the range of experience, right? Whether it's more uplifting, energizing, cerebral, or relaxing, comforting, calming. All right, so if you were to take the essential oil within the cannabis plant, right, predominantly there's cannabinoids that can be up to 25-30% of the dry weight, right? Followed by the primary and secondary terpenes that could be there in 3 to 5.5% amounts, right? And then you have these other very volatile trace aromatics like these sulfuric compounds, esters, thiols, aldehydes, right? And those could be there in like 1,000th the amount of the terpenes, right? Like part per billion amount. So a lot of them like almost beyond the abilities of modern chemistry equipment to be able to test, right? And so they're there in really small amounts, but clearly can have a huge impact on the smell and flavor, right? And so a lot of those compounds, right? They can be majorly contributing to the unique flavors and aromas, right? And for all the future product development, all that stuff. But when it comes to the effects that a strain can provide, right? The sativa or indica, right? So much of the terpene content present is really the major driving factors around those unique nuanced variations in effect, right?
That's what I've been asking people. That's what I've been wondering also, because this whole report is about the aroma, but how does it affect the effects? And you're saying it's really the terpenes that are doing
100%. Yeah. So think about it too like this, because so you could have a strain of cannabis, right, that tests, say, 25% THC, right? And say one of the strains was terpinolene dominant, which is the terpene responsible for the very sativa type smell, like the haze, right? Trainwreck, Jack, Durban Poison, the classic haze smell, right? So say you had an example where it was 25% THC and it was Trainwreck, right, which is really high terpinolene, right? So that's going to be very much energizing, artistically inspiring, cerebral type effect, right? And then you could have another strain that's 25%. That's a classic quote unquote indica that could be really high in myrcene, right, which is going to contribute towards a more relaxing, comforting, just sedative effect. So if those plants were both harvested right? And they're fresh and the aromatics are super present, there could be, say, 3 to 5% terpene content there, right? So the cannabinoid to terpene ratio in those could be like a 4 to 1 or 3 to 1, right? So the presence and the influence of these aromatics are going to contribute in a big way to making the effects, weight more towards this energizing side or towards this sedating side. But in this example, if both of these strains, right, like so say Granddaddy Purple on the indica end and Trainwreck on the sativa end, both 25%, both 4% terpenes, right? Right. Whatever that is, like a 6 to 1 cannabis terp ratio. So, but if both of those strains were harvested and dried and cured like shit, smell like hay, right? All the aromatics are gone, then there could be 0.5% terps. That's like 100 to 1 cannabis terp ratio. So when those aromatics have gone away because they weren't being treated like produce to maintain and retain these aromatics, then you lose the entourage effect. Then once you're at like 100 to 1 cannabis terp ratio, that's kind of what biomass is in the future, in my opinion. When the aromatics are gone, there's no more value for that to be represented as an artisan product with unique aromatics present and preserved, and since they're so far away from their natural present amounts, now it's kind of just biomass that could be distilled, and you could at the end add terpenes back, you know, um, because the terpenes are essentially they're like the canary in the coal mine of the aromatics. Because if the terpenes, if which because the so 5 to 9 primary and secondary mono and sesquiterpenes are what define 95% of the aromatic presence in each strain, right? And so monoterpenes, they have, of the terpene class, they have the lowest boiling point, right? So at around room temperature and above, they're kind of slowly going away, right? And so as these volatile terpenes are going away, you pretty much guaranteed to have lost most of the other precious aromatics or flavorants like the thiols and esters and aldehydes, right?
Yeah.
Because most of those are really volatile, right? A lot of these volatile aromatics don't even make it past harvest, right?
Right.
Like you could smell them in the fresh plant right before you harvest it, but when you harvest it, it's like whether or not those maintain to the point where somebody could actually enjoy them really more has largely to do with how well the preservation took place, right? Because I think the really interesting, because everybody's trying to like define, what defines quality in cannabis, right? And everybody's been so hyper focused on THC as the only way to discern quality that, like, I think in a big way, it's almost a sign of how immature the market is. We haven't even been able to understand what really defines quality, right? And and so what happens is like essentially people treat cabbage better than they treat cannabis, right? Like even though what happens when you treat cannabis like cabbage, what happens is you're able to perfectly preserve and retain all the most precious volatile aromatics that actually are what define the quality and the sticky factor. And whether you open a jar and it bombs the neighborhood, like,
Yeah.
because like I'm a judge at the Emerald Cup last 7 years. SC Labs, we developed a terpene classification system that has been implemented by the California State Fair and by the Emerald Cup to be the foundation of the competition. And so what we do is we test all the entries, and then by the chemistry content, terpenes, cannabinoids, right? Everything's sorted and grouped into their own flavor and smell classes, right? So like competes against like, right? Because how could you judge like a train wreck or like piff, right, against Girl Scout cookies, right? It's a totally different fruit, totally different smell or flavor. And really when it comes down to it, it comes down to personal preference or regional bias, right? Our endocannabinoid systems, like what smells great to me might not to you, right? Flavor and aroma, right? Some people like the taste of cilantro is soapy, or the taste of chocolate and cacao is too bitter, right? So I think so much of the experience of cannabis and the flavor and aroma and effects really come down to user and unique endocannabinoid system preference, right? And so with the Emerald Cup, we basically, so all the entries are tested and sorted and then presented to the judges after they've been anonymized in their own smell classes. So a judge will get 100 entries and then they'll be color coded, right? So red will be the sativa class, right? The terpenylene class, which is because terpenylene is like indistinguishable, right? It's like if you can smell it, so I guess part of what I'm getting to is like it's not that terpenes you can't use to categorize. It's like, there's just other things that can really contribute, right? Because, terpenylene is one of those terpenes where it's like if there's any terpenylene in there, they all group together. You smell it, and you could, if you smelled 20 strains all with terpenylene, you'd be like, oh yeah, these all are more similar than, say, these myrcene dominant strains like blueberry or granddaddy purple or purple urkel, right? Which, if you smelled all those, you'd be like, oh, these all group together. So terpenes you can use to group and make the first kind of sorting to where things like Merlot with Merlot, Chardonnay with Chardonnay. But then there's all this infinite subgrouping that happens once within a primary grouping that can basically come out from the unique variation in all these other trace aromatics like esters and kind of sulfurs, right? And so um so yeah, so gas competes against gas, desserts against desserts, tropical floral against tropical and floral, sweet and dream against sweet and dream, piney against piney, haze against haze, right? So that's kind of, because our whole body of work with SC Labs over the last 15 years, because we've tested hundreds of thousands of strains of cannabis and hemp, and we've learned a tremendous amount about, averages versus potentials and like how the plant expresses itself. And so, our whole kind of path has been just trying to get people to see and appreciate the role that terpenes play, right? There's all these other trace volatile aromatics you can just get deeper and deeper and deeper on, but the foundation of how you can do the first groupings and sorting is based on terpene content, right? But then once you in their own categories, then you can still notice that there's all these different uniqueness smell, right? That contribute from these other compounds, like these canaflavin or sulfurs and all these other things. But again, it's like so across hundreds of thousands of tests that we've tested on cannabis and hemp, the average terpene content in dried flower is about 1.4%, right? The potential when it's most sticky and cured and fresh is 3 to 5.5%, right?
Yeah.
The average herb on retail shelves is about 1% or less. The average pre-roll on retail shelves is about 0.5% or less, right? And what this really shows is how volatile these compounds are and how most of them are gone by the time the average consumer is buying a branded product on retail shelves. Because in the 30, 45 days it takes from when the herb was off dried and perfectly cured and preserved and top shelf, the 30, 45 days from that point to retail shelves, 80%'s gone because nobody's treating their herb like cabbage, because everybody's just having it sit around in room temperature warehouses, or they're grinding at 75 degrees, right? Like, so there's all these moments where like, the terpenes, it's like the perishable factor in cannabis, right? And
The
so
perishable factor, yeah.
yeah, because if the terpenes are like going away, then like you guaranteed you lost pretty much most of all the other really awesome things that contribute to the flavor and aroma. So it's not that the terpenes are irrelevant. They're actually incredibly important for one, because thinking about it again in that term, right? So because with the Emerald Cup, right, like we've tracked since 2013 when we started doing terpene testing. We would look at, okay, the average cannabinoid content across all the entries versus the top 20 judge pick winners that are anonymous, right? You could always see that THC level has never had anything to do with what a judge picks as a winner. There's never a correlation. But when you look at terpene content, it's quite the opposite, right? So whenever you look at the average terpene content across the hundreds of entries that were entered versus the top 20 anonymous judge picked winners, you can always see that the terpene content in a judge pick winner in a really prestigious competition is always at least one or higher standard deviation content in terpene more than the average. So you can see that terpene content is much more of a predictive indicator of what a judge, an expert judge, is going to pick as a winner of a competition of 500 entries. You can always see that the terpene content is much more of a contributing factor than cannabinoid content or anything else, right? And so because and also with when it comes to these other trace aromatics, right? Like the smell of gas, right? Like that's not a terpene. That's these sulfuric thiol type compounds, which are very volatile, right? And so the human nose can pick up these thiol type compounds at like part per trillion levels, right? The human olfactory system is really sensitive. It's almost beyond the capability of a lot of modern mass spectrometry, right? And so, and that's the reason why they'll add the smell of like rotten eggs to natural gas, right? So if there's a leak, you can pick it up at incredibly tiny amounts, right? And so these, so in the instance of gas, the smell of gas, right? Like you'll have, a typical kind of strain of like OG Kush or sour diesel, right? Like you can always see it's like usually codominant in limonene, myrcene, caryophyllene as the top three terpenes. Then there's humulene and linalool as the secondary terpenes, right? And so you can use those terpenes to kind of see, okay, these all group together. But then once all those strains are grouped together, you can see some of those, like a lot of those have the gas smell. Some of them don't at all. Some of them will be more fruity, and that's because either the presence or absence of these very trace tiny aromatics, right?
Right.
That
Darn
even
it.
though they're there in a hundredth or a thousandth the amount of the primary aromatics, they can still clearly have overwhelming effects on making this smell gassy or not at all, right? Because then there's these other aromatics that like abstracts help to kind of identify. One's they're calling one Tropicana sulfur,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so that's one of these volatile aromatics that's actually, or I take it back, it's not volatile, right? So there's so the smell of that like tangy or forbidden fruit, right? It's this very citrusy kind of smell. It's not a terpene. It's like one of these
Yeah.
canosulfurs, right? They're calling Tropicana sulfur, but in the instance of this specific compound, that's not really volatile because like that smell will remain when all the terpenes have gone away. So
Mm.
it's atypical to the typical aromat
Oh,
trace aromatic because most of the trace aromatics are very volatile, and if the terpenes are going away, you pretty much lost the other really unique flavor aromatic compounds. But in this certain instance of the Tropicana sulfur class, kind of that citrus smell. You can notice like 6, 8 months later, after, like the terpene content could have been like 3.5%, but then if it was dried and cured like shit and it doesn't even smell very present, you'll see the terpenes go down to like 1% or less, but you can still smell that Tropicana sulfur because it's so like pungent and aromatic, you know, and it's
right.
not as volatile, right? So
Right.
so it's a complex kind of equation, right? The terpenes, cannabinoids, right? Like and I was starting to get into that, like if you were to take the anatomy of a bud, right? Like, you could have in the essential oil, you could have up to 25-30% cannabinoids, followed by 3 to 5% terpenes, followed by zero point 0.1, 0.2% other aromatics, right? So there's so many of these other trace volatiles that they're there in such tiny quantities relative to the terpenes, but again, they can hugely contribute to the flavor and aroma, right? And so, but again, whether or not they're there really has more largely to do with how well somebody's preserving their herb. Because for the average consumer, why does it matter, right? Are you getting them or not? Are you when you purchase a top shelf flower, is it top shelf or not, right? Like when you roll a joint and smoke it, does it have that ring on it? You know that ring, the essential oil halo, right?
No, you mean, no, maybe I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, 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 totally. So if you smoke a joint of some really fresh herb it's really terpenic, right? Super high aromatic presence. When you smoke the joint, like right below the cherry, you'll see this oil ring. It's like an essential oil halo, right?
Ah,
Which is actually for a consumer at home, that's like the defining factor whether or not they got their money's worth, right?
Right.
Like,
Right.
because at or below average, like 1.4%, there's no ring. The ring's gone, right? Because so much of your aromatics are gone. So much of the primary terpenes present, as well as whatever trace aromatics, are all gone, right? So you don't have that ring. So as a result, the flavor aroma is kind of lacking, right? But if you were to smoke something that's in that 3 to 5% range, right, where 3% cannabinoids, 20% or excuse me, like 20% cannabinoids, 3% terpenes, right? Like 10 to 1 cannab to terp ratio or closer, right? The flavor of and presence of the aromatics and the unique entourage effects are going to be substantial, right? So anything like 10 to 1 cannab to terp ratio or closer is the loudest, most flavorful, most aromatic, most entourage effect packed effect you've ever experienced. But as those terpenes go away, you guaranteed to lose all the other aromatics. So all of a sudden, the flavor aroma starts going away. The entourage effect starts going away. Because then at a certain point, when you're at that like 100 to 1 cannab to terp ratio, you know, there's no more difference between the sativa or this indica. It's mainly a THC effect. It's like smoking Marinol, right? It's just pure THC or smoking distillate.
Like you're saying, does it really matter to the end consumer if we're going to if this is this new thing, we can boost these the aroma. But if we can boost by doing that, by boosting the aroma and enhancing the terpenes, if that also enhances the effect, that's going to matter to the end consumer.
That matters to the consumer. Exactly. Whether or not they buy a joint and it has the terpene ring on it matters everything to the end consumer, because it's like that's showing that they paid for a top shelf product, that the flavor and aroma is going to be incredibly present, and that the uniqueness of the high is going to be there. You know,
Yeah, I mean, it has to be, right? I
Mm,
mean, it has to be
100%.
go into the entourage. It has
Yeah,
to
exactly.
it has to play
Yeah.
into the entourage
Yeah,
effect,
but the
right?
entourage effect is gone as you start going outside 10 to
Yeah.
1 and out up towards 100 to 1, right?
Yeah,
You
yeah,
know,
yeah. So,
because
so
well, I was just going to make the point. So because we operate in California, we have a lab in Oregon, Colorado, Michigan, Arizona, but in Arizona, or excuse me, in Oregon. So I believe Oregon has been the canary in the coal mine that blew out the market first. They legalized. There was overproduction that set in. Overproduction leads to price compression, leads to potency inflation among laboratories that are
oh,
fraudulent.
yeah.
Then all of a sudden, everybody's running around with 45% THC flower, and through the flood, because nobody's even paying attention to preservation and treating their herb like cabbage. So everybody's running around with 45% flower, but by the time a consumer buys anything on the shelf, it's all hay, it's all flat. It's high inflated potency, but there's no flavor or aroma. So what happens is the consumer, there's no loyalty. They just bounce from brand to brand or pre-roll to pre-roll, just looking for something with a little
Right,
flavor, searching
right.
off THC and always disappointed, right? Because again, like from the trend, but through the flood, like in this time, where the market kind of collapses because of overproduction and nobody treating their herb like cabbage, then, everything on the shelf in that 30 to 45 day window it takes the herb to make it to shelf branded, like all the aromatics are well below average, right? Again, average 1.4%, potential 3 to 5.5%. The average branded product on retail shelves is 1% or less. The average pre-roll, 0.5% or less. And so the
So,
consumer is totally fucked over,
yeah,
buying off this number that really doesn't mean anything and having a subpar experience every time. Because what we learned and what we've seen in Oregon and also now in California, the brands that really build resilience, through the flooded times where the market has no, you know, um, appreciation for what really defines quality. The people we've seen succeed and build resilience, instead of continuously doubling down on preservation, or excuse me, instead of continuously doubling down on more and more production, if anything, the people that scale back a bit and double down on terpene preservation infrastructure to treat their herb like cabbage, to never have, from the time it's harvested, never have it below, or excuse me, never have the herb exposed to anything above 60 degrees. So it's like a continued cold supply chain of custody all the way through to the point of consumer purchase. Because just thinking about cabbage and the life cycle of cabbage, right? If you had cabbage for like a few days here or there across this 45-day window to grocer, if it's just kind of pulled out of the fridge and just sitting in like 70-degree temperature, for a few hours here and a few hours there, and just going in transport in the back of a car that's at 85 degrees in the trunk. The cannabis supply chain is like the glove compartment effect in slow motion. It's
Yeah.
like if you've ever had really nice, sticky, amazing herb in a glove compartment and you forget about it in a hot summer day. Yeah, because like if you just like forget about it and have it in your trunk and then you go back like after a hot day, it's toast, right? All the aromatics are gone.
Yeah,
It turned into cardboard, and it's because of the heat exposure, and how quickly it'll turn based on heat, right? And so the thing is the people that we've seen kind of, shift into a cold supply chain of custody where they're really mindful about the temperatures they're harvesting under, right? Because it's like when you harvest plants like during the daytime, right, when it's 100 degrees outside, you might lose 30% off the top, right? And not just the terpenes, but guaranteed to lose all the other trace volatiles like thiols and esters, you know, and part of this too is like, you know, like comparing it to the wine industry, right? So there was like 30 years of agronomy that went into studying the cultivation of wine grapes, right? And what the whole wine industry learned is, you do not harvest grapes past a certain time in the morning once the sun comes up, right? Because for the winemaker that's buying the grapes, like they're buying based off the presence of these precious volatile trace aromatics, right? And what happens is they harvest within the Kelvin cycle, right? So photosynthesis, right? So in the cycle of photosynthesis, like, in at nighttime, right? Like, so throughout the day, basically, you have all like the terpenes and aromatics. They're these defense mechanisms that plants produce to block from the UV exposure from the sun, to like the protection agents, right? To kind of repel predators or to call in and lure pollinators, right? And so throughout the day, with the intensity of the sun and the UV, right, they're like releasing and off gassing, right? And then at nighttime they're recharging, right? And what happens is right in the morning, which is the completion of the Kelvin cycle, right when the sun starts coming up and the heat start rising, like they actually have these microscope videos and pictures staring at the stomata of plants. And at a certain point in the morning, when the sun's rising and the heat's rising, all the pores on the plant will open up like mouths, and they'll respire an off gas, a big chunk of the terpenes and aromatics that the plant built up that night, right? And so the wine growers, or like the difference in between growing grapes and growing wine grapes is timing of harvest, right? Because whenever you harvest before that moment where they respire the built up aromatics, then you keep them instead of lose them. Because the thing is, from the time you harvest, all those aromatics, it's just a downhill loss factor from that point on. Whether it's a terpene, whether it's any of these other aromatics, right? And so the people that are really in tune with this, they're like hyper mindful of the time of day they're harvesting, so they're retaining, not losing, right? Because if you're harvesting an acre of weed in the 80, 90, 100-degree sun, you literally sacrificed so much of the aromatics that you grew the entire year for, right? And so people that are most dialed with it, they're harvesting at night or the early morning before the sun rises, right? It's like, so the temperature, think about the temperature, and then they're immediately getting that herb to 60 degrees or below for this long, slow and dry cure process, right? For, the low and slow, they call it, right? And then from the time it's dry and ready to kind of start curing, same thing. They're keeping it at or below 60, right? And then when they're trimming it and processing it, right, they're at or below 60, right? It's in long-term storage, right, it's at or below 60, right? Whenever it's then being packaged, processed, transported, at or below 60, right? So by the time that 30, 45-day window passes and that branded herb makes it to retail shelves, that might still have 3 to 4 or 5% terpene content in it. So that's hundreds of percent more sticky, aromatic, and flavorful than anything else on the shelf because the preservation that they built into their supply chain, right? Because the whole concept of preservation is equal, if not more important than what the individual compounds are, right? Because again, when you really understand the volatility of these compounds, it's like, because again, it's like, so 5 of the 6 primary terpenes in cannabis, they're monoterpenes, right? So limonene, myrcene, terpinolene, pinene, ocimene, like these are like the most present terpenes in cannabis. Then there's the sesquiterpenes, which are slightly bigger compounds like caryophyllene and humulene. Those have a slightly higher boiling point. But but again, it's like the terpenes, if like, the terpenes, the monoterpenes, which are the lowest boiling point ones, those like tracking how well those are staying and being preserved is an indication of how rich and present all these other aromatics are. Because it's like, because if the terpenes, these monoterpenes, if they're compromised and you lost half of them, you can guarantee pretty much anything and most everything else in this world of aromatics and flavorants, those are gone, you know? And so it's like one of those things where, um, like again, like people we've seen building resilience where they're selling out quicker than it's trimmed at the highest price the market can bear in and through the deepest floods year after year. Those people built brands that have a cold supply chain of custody to where they're able, because through the flood it's like when consumers are just no loyalty, it's because they're looking for something in a desert. They're looking for this oasis product in the desert and they can't find it. But then whenever they come across, like when everything else on the shelf is 1% or less, but they come across a brand that's sitting at like 300% more sticky, flavorful, aromatic compounds, that's a consumer that's going to be like, oh, wow, I'm going to buy this product every time, right? So you see,
Yeah.
in areas like California and Oregon, these brands that through the flood, while everybody else is collapsing, because
Yeah.
everybody's just on this commodity race to the bottom, high THC, everything's flat like hay. The people that are like, take terpene preservation and aromatic preservation really seriously, to treat herb like cabbage, they are the ones that have this moment where they're coming up and building like forever brands that have grassroots loyalty that buy their product anytime they find it because they know how much,
Yeah.
how much that group did to kind of ensure the experience is there. Because that's one of the things, back in the day, in the medical days, the average consumer was a lot more commonly able to find something that was sticky, that you could stick to a window, because of how, aromatic and preserved and fresh it was. Now people are so like mindful and cognizant of package date because they're like, oh, if this is packaged a month or two ago, I don't even want to buy it because it's probably toast, But people are having to pay so much attention to these package dates because nobody's upstream paying attention to treating their herb like cabbage. Well,
Yeah.
and the whole indoor outdoor thing, that's kind of really, I think, a really big conversation. It's fascinating because like typically in all markets, the highest price of the most premium bomb sun-grown flower is still below the most shitty indoor price. Because for whatever reason, indoor is put on this pedestal because it looks nicer, right? Even
Yeah.
though when it comes to terpenes, there's no difference, right? Like, because they're either there or they're not, right? And the difference in a really bomb indoor herb or a sun-grown herb, again, it's more largely to do with, are the terps present and preserved or not? You can
Yeah.
have the most awesome or the most shit indoor, or the most awesome or the most shit outdoor, right? But whenever even sun-grown is, because whenever you can like, have a more sophisticated measure of what defines quality beyond just, okay, let's reduce it to this one number THC, then you can start like evaluating herb across categories, right?
Hmm.
Whether it's sun grown or mixed light or indoor or light deprivation, right? Like when it comes to, again, it's like, you could have like, so with the Emerald Cup, right? Like, you have the indoor category, you have the sun-grown category, mixed light category, right? All the entries are anonymized, all in their own flavor classes. So a judge, they can put their terpene bias aside, right? Like, because they might like Girl Scout cookies or purple candy gas dessert stuff, but and so that's might be their preference. But whenever things are grouped in their own categories, they can kind of put their bias aside and they could be like, okay, even though train wreck in this terpinolene class, right, is not my cup of tea, I can still line these 10 up and identify which is the better example, right? And again, whenever you look at the data, the anonymous judge pick winners really clearly have more to do with presence and preserved aromatics, right? And what they would like have like rise up to be a winner of a flavor class. And because then once you see all the winners, right? Then the winners of the sun grown category will compete against the winners of the indoor category. And very often, like this, if you were to take the best sun grown and the best indoor and then roll them up, blind smoke them,
Yeah.
very oftentimes like the sun grown is going to win,
Oh,
right?
really? Okay, I was one.
Oh
Okay,
yeah. Oh
you
yeah.
always hear different. You always hear people talk about different.
Totally. Well, because and a part of that too, it's like you can't mimic the sun, like
I
indoor
know,
lighting,
I know,
right?
I know.
There's all
Yeah.
the UVA, B, and C
Uh,
spectrum, right? And
yeah.
so much of these UV spectrum are the things that really bring out these volatile aromatics, right?
Uh,
Like, so a lot of these other secondary metabolites that the plant produces, like terpenes, like esters, like like thiols, right? These, like they, you very often, I mean, when you look at like the average, like the best of a class, like sun grown, oftentimes certain strains genetically, like and like taking into account how they were harvested and preserved, like you could see again 3 to 5.5%. We've never seen an indoor herb test 5.5% in terpenes. Like a lot of the indoor herb would see max out at like 3.5%. You know, a part of that's how it's cultivated, but a big part of that's lighting, right? Because
right.
of the absence or the presence of like so many of the critical aspects of the sun that bring out the secondary metabolites, right? So it's like I think our indoor is gets a pass and like somehow is put on a pedestal because like if you look at an indoor herb versus an outdoor herb, it's like clearly the indoor is a lot more aesthetically pleasing. But when it
Yeah.
comes to terpenes, it's like just because it looks better doesn't mean it's better, and it's like and if you were to evaluate things all on a similar level, because in the future I believe like the average consumer will be outraged for one at the price they've been paying all along to smoke cardboard,
Yeah. Yeah.
because of how little these brands are paying attention to the preservation and the cold supply chain of custody, which is kind of required to to really like maintain a premium product, indoor
That
or outdoor, Um,
I hear that same statement over and over from, the cultivators, extractors, people really doing this like you. That's the biggest complaint I'm hearing, exactly what you're saying. And I don't know, I guess it would cost a lot of money to get this cold chain supply
well, I
all
mean,
retail.
I mean, like so a lot of like the old school legends in Humboldt and the Emerald Triangle, like they had it right all along, right? They built underground herb cellars, right? Where because if you dig into the ground 3 feet under, you're at a steady 55 degrees, 55% humidity year round, right? So it's like that's the most perfect preservation temperature and humidity that you could ever be in. And so that's a way that historically people were able to preserve the freshness and the most precious aspects that really define quality, in a time where, they didn't have, like before it was legal, but they were able to do this, kind of without having to pay all the, the HVAC kind of air conditioning costs, right? Because yeah, it's if you're gonna have like a refrigerated supply chain and have to use refrigeration and cold kind of as a thing, it's like, yeah, that's a big increase in cost with kind of the AC and all the electricity, but that's where it's like these old school like
Yeah.
ways were actually the future,
Right,
to
they
begin with.
knew, but it's just that, like you said, it just shows the immaturity of the industry.
Yeah,
You know,
totally.
it just shows like you guys are like, don't you guys see it? And now we're all kind of catching up, all of us out here.
Right. Yeah, and that's where we've been trying, over since 2013 when we launched terpene testing, we've been trying to impress the importance of terpenes, right? It's not to say that they're the only things that matter, but they're
Yeah,
the most present aromatics that define the difference between effect and sativa or indica, right? And they're
right,
either there or they're not, you know?
right.
And just as an example, so a good buddy that won the Emerald Cup a few years ago. He had given me a pound of some incredible sun-grown organic cup
Mm,
winning kind of herb. It was this double OG chem. And I had this pound turkey bag that I kept in the fridge from when I got it in October
mm,
till August when I was pretty much done with it, right? And so it never left the fridge. I only opened the turkey bag like 4 times through the year, so I could take out like a like quarter pound that I have in a separate jar that I would open and close. I would still keep that in the fridge, in between use,
uh,
instead of just sit there and bake in the like hot days environment. But that's the one I would open and close, right? And whenever I was pulling the last of it out, like close to 8, 9 months later, you
you could,
know, it was better than pretty much everybody's herb at the moment, right? Like, because I could roll up joints. You smoke the joint, it's got the halo on it, the terpene ring, the essential oil halo, because that's the biggest at-home kind of indicator for a consumer without having all the mass spectrometry and, you know, it's like that's like the immediate indicator of whether or not you bought a premium product, right? Does it or does it not have that halo, that essential oil halo present? And so a year later, I mean, 8, 9 months later, the herb that I was smoking had a halo more present than like the indoor herb or even like the sun-grown herb that people were sharing or were smoking, right? And it just kind of goes to show, it's like aging herb is not necessarily a bad thing as long as the preservation and the care for it is such that you're ensuring that you're not losing, like it's not, because to me, like it's the perishability factor, right? The perishability factor more has to do with the temperature and humidity that you kind of have your herb sitting in consistently throughout the time it's in your possession, you know, because again, that's the determining factor of whether your aromatics are all present, right? The terpenes, the esters, the phthals, flavonoids, right? Because whenever that type of a preservation strategy isn't in place, then it's just like day by day, there's this slow loss happening to where like by the time that, because I feel like that's why so many, brands are almost doomed, in the legal market because,
yeah,
they put their life into growing this herb perfectly and they grow it and it's perfect. But then once they bring it down, trim it, then they give it to a distributor and 80% of the value is lost once they give it away to go sell the
yeah, it's,
distributor, because the distributor's not like oftentimes refrigerating their herb. They're having it sit in a warehouse where during the daytime it gets to
I know.
87, during the nighttime it goes to 60. So it's this day to night fluctuation in temperature, humidity over a 40-day period. And then by the time that herb's on shelves, it doesn't sell anymore. So now the distributor is going back to the farmer trying to renegotiate price because they can't sell the herb, but it was in their possession that it lost the entire value of why it was bombed to begin with,
I
right?
know. So really the vaults that they have in the dispensaries to lock everything up, legally, they call it the vault or something, that
Yeah,
keep it all under lock. It should be,
refrigerated vault.
yeah, a
Yeah,
refrigerator
yeah.
vault. You go
Because
into a
otherwise
restaurant,
they're buying all this material and it's just going
yeah,
bad by the day,
and it's
just
gonna
like
ruin the
without
whole,
even them realizing it. Because they just have it all smashed into a vault, but the vault's like sitting at like 75 degrees.
yeah, close that vault on a hot day or any,
Yeah.
I
Oh
mean,
yeah, it's gone.
and
Yeah.
and then and then the transport trucks,
Yep,
in
exactly.
world, it should be like a pharmaceutical that needs refrigeration, where
Yeah, yeah,
where
exactly. Or like
the
fresh
dispensers,
produce. Yeah,
yeah,
totally.
or fresh produce. I'm sure, yeah,
Totally.
produce. Like put it in a refrigerated truck that
Yeah,
drives around and
totally.
that drops off this stuff like this.
100%. Because yeah,
So
just think again about like strawberries or berries, right? It's like,
yeah,
so much of the berries from that are harvested and sold across the nation, They're grown in California, but it's like, just thinking about like the life cycle of a berry until you go buy it from the grocery store shelf. It's like if there was any breaks in the cold supply chain in custody where it's just sitting around or transported at like whatever temperature, it's like by the
Yeah.
time you're buying it, it's dog shit. It's
Yeah.
like there's
Yeah.
no more value, right? Like as you'd be like, oh, you could both see it and feel it and taste, right? Like the difference because there was a break in the custody, right, and how it was transported and taken care of, right? And so I think kind of that type of idea, like either like how trans or pharmaceuticals are transported cold, or even
Or
or even more like produce, right? Because I think that's more of a similar thing you could compare, right? Because it's an agricultural crop product that has shelf life, right? And
right.
so
Yeah.
much of that shelf
Exactly.
life is
Exactly.
again determined on how it was treated, right, along the way to shelf,
That's
right?
right.
Because because so few people, whether it's on a farmer side of things, because I mean, a lot of this awareness is like the highest level awareness that in California and Oregon, the leaders in the entire national global game have figured out over 30, 40 years of trial and error, and even still, a lot of them, they're having the damnedest time surviving because they don't realize that, all their hard work is going to shit once they pass it to their distributor. That, because when I talk to farmers, I'm like, dude, you need to be discerning of who you're even working with. Are they treating your herb in the way you would treat it to make sure it stays top shelf? Or does it lose 75% of the value by the time it's on the shelf? Because then if it loses 75% of the value, your brand is not getting any solid. If anything, your brand, somebody's buying it and then they're like, oh, this tastes and smells like shit. I'm never buying this brand again.
I
You know?
bet. Yeah.
So
I mean, yeah. I guess we're building the industry like for for the Canna Curious, the
mhm.
newcomers on the THC alone, because we don't have like, based on this conversation, we've lost a lot of the stuff that's going to give everybody that, you
So
know.
therefore we have to reduce it down to this one ignorant number, kind of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think until we can figure out, or the industry grows enough to get these systems in place,
Mhm.
we're screwed, really. I mean, it's a fact what you're
It's a
saying.
fact. Yeah. Well,
And I,
yeah, and it's such an unfortunate reality too, because so many farmers put their life and soul into this plant,
I know.
and then they don't even have a chance because the people they
I
work
know.
with, and so that's
The system's not set up yet.
yeah, totally,
The infrastructure is not completed.
totally,
It's in there, it's just not completed.
totally.
I definitely this is gonna definitely be included. This would be a great section, like for your section, to talk about this. So this is really perfect to add to the whole scope of everything. Like if we're gonna get to that next level to elevate these miners, we've gotta,
We
there's
got
no.
to cherish the just basic, aromatics present. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, we've got to finish the infrastructure.
Yeah, totally,
You know,
100%.
yeah. Okay, so that's perfect. So that really solves like I think the answer, because I know I've also heard that they all complain about the testing equipment is too expensive. Like if you were to put it, along your supply chain, like, okay, we just harvested, or we throw it in in cold storage, but this is what we have. This is our COA for that. Now we've put it into so now we know what we're going into the curing process with, what we came out with. Now what we know what we're going into extraction with. So they've all talked about having those tools to help them along the way to find this. But I feel like what you're saying could almost cut that out more, because
Yeah,
if you just practice this from cultivation,
yeah.
then you've got
You
that.
can smell if those other things are there or not, because it's like those, because yeah, the instrument, because so abstracts, they're in a unique position, right? They're not a throughput testing laboratory, they're an R&D research laboratory. They have like this 2D GC mass spec, like time of flight, very, very expensive mass spec, right? But they're not using that to develop testing to kind of test for people making products. They're doing it for their own product development. They'll test and find out what makes all the unique strains unique so that they
Yeah,
can recreate kind of terpene blends so they can sell to people, of like these blends of they're like a flavor house, a terpene
yeah,
house. They make the botanically derived and other kind of mixtures of terpenes. And so, so they'll, kind of be able to, but like the idea of having a test as a laboratory like ourself or like a compliance testing laboratory, it doesn't make sense because for one, like these aromatics beyond terpenes, right? They're there in such tiny amounts. Most herb doesn't have them, right? Because for one, the infrastructure and the cold chain isn't even there, right? So the value of those testing for those would be really upstream to farmers or to breeders so they can see
Yeah,
what's
yeah.
unique or whatever. But for again the consumer, it's like on a packaging seeing like point zero
Oh,
one
yeah, no,
percent
no.
thiol.
Yeah,
That's insignificant. They can smell is there gas there or not, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah, yeah.
and so and because again it's like that's where I think kind of because I've heard kind of in their like rise to stardom and kind of they're helping to define and identify these compounds. They're trying to kind of position it in a way where the terpenes are less important. They're
Hmm.
actually some of the most important aromatics there. They're for one, they're like 95% of the aromatic compounds present are the terpenes,
Yeah,
followed by these other very trace amounts of these other things. And that's why I'm always trying to kind of position it's like these are really important, but if you want those to kind of show up so your consumer can appreciate them, like
you need,
let's like look at how you're like storing and transporting it. Let's talk about how you're harvesting. It's like because again, it's like if you're harvesting for the premium product, it's like I think the industries and the farmers are going to move more towards how wine grapes are harvested, where
yeah,
they're
I
like
love that.
because it's like if you were going to be starting if you grew these plants for 9 months, put your lifeblood into it, and then you harvest them at 100-degree temperatures where you like went from what was 5% now to 3% as your max. It's like, like you probably lost most of the other aromatics, right? Because again, like a lot of these volatile aromatics, they don't make it past harvest because of the way the temperatures they're harvested under, the temperatures they're dried under, the processing, right? And then with pre-rolling, right? Right, because pre-rolls are the lowest terpene presence of all categories because, when you grind up herb, you expose all the surface area of the bud to whatever the temperature is. So if you're
Yeah,
like grinding at like room temperature, it's so you could have harvested your plants at 100 degrees daytime, you just lost 30% off the top. Then you dry it, cure it like subpar, like at 70 degrees or something. So you're slowly losing more there. And then you grind up the herb, you just lost like, so in the process of temperature of harvest, drying, grinding, you just lost 80%, right? Before you're even like, you're still like 3 weeks out from retail shelf, right?
yeah,
So as opposed to, the plants being harvested cold in the right kind of cycle of the conclusion of the Kelvin cycle to where
yeah,
they're retaining, and then you keep it cold, right? By the time like and then you grind it like at 60 degrees, air conditioned, like cold in temperature, right? Like you're like and then you're keeping it cold to the point where it's on retail shelves. You're almost guaranteeing the consumer experience to have these volatile aromatics present, in a way that, they wouldn't be there otherwise, and it has less to do with whether you tested them or not. It has more to do with the way you built a supply chain to keep it cold, and
yeah,
preservation in
yeah.
mind kind of thing.
Yeah, that exactly. So you really enlightened me in that area. But I feel like when I've talked to them, they're just like, well, we're flying blind. We need to see, not at the end, like you're saying, but within their supply of however they're moving along there. But
Mhm.
but I think the preservation is super key. And then I mean, and then even future, I think that's just a big topic of how do we even build this infrastructure even more? So we're not losing 80%. That's just another topic of going deeper, like what is that? How do we do that?
Totally. Well, and because that's also where, like I see, because I train the judges at the Emerald Cup. I'm the lead judge. And we helped SC Labs implement this terpene classification system, like, because with the State Fair and the Emerald Cup, right? Like, there's, like again competes against like. So because how could you judge like a train wreck versus an OG Kush, right? Like totally different smell, right? And like again, what smells good and tastes good to you might not to me. Some people love gas, some people hate gas, right? But you group them, present them to people sorted, right? Because then the consumer can become an Emerald Cup judge, right? Like, because we're working with dispensaries like this, right? Because when you go into a dispensary shelf, there's like 100 jars with different names. How do you even approach that, right? It's like, but whenever you go to a dispensary where this kind of a classification system's present, you go to you walk in, there's a sensory station, right, where somebody smells an OG Kush. You smell a train wreck. You smell a pineapple Thai, right? You smell a Granddaddy Purple, right? And then you're like, oh, I really like this OG Kush and this train wreck. So then you get sent to the section of the menu where all the hazes are, all the tropical florals are, right? And kind of approaching it like the way that a judge would approach the Emerald Cup entries, right? Where you then have, instead of 100 jars, you have 10 jars, and you could line these 10 up, and you could smell, assess, smoke, and then come to your own conclusion. Because that's what's fascinating, whether or not as a Emerald Cup judge on the highest level of connoisseur or a consumer, you come to the same conclusion if you're able to deduce it down to these like grouped in similar smell classes, right? Like you could like smell and assess, and you're like, oh wow, these five barely even like have the sticky, or when I smoke a joint, there's no terpene ring, so I can tell the flavor and aroma is not there as much. But in these two, it's got the terpene ring, it's sticky, it's flavorful, it's aromatic. So, without even being a expert sommelier, you still come to the same conclusion that they would otherwise, right? Because like you're helping to kind of reduce down the variables, to where somebody
Yeah.
can compare like against like.
Yeah, I love that idea. It's more like if everybody's putting it into effects, sleep,
Hmm.
anxiety, whatever, pain.
Hmm.
And then within that, if you say like the category, these haze, strains, uh
Hmm.
treat anxiety. So it's
Hmm.
kind of like, oh, I'm going in for the effect. What kind of
Hmm.
strain and then you start smelling. Oh,
Hmm.
so it's like it's putting it in that path. I kind of see that
Hmm.
together.
Totally.
That's a really good idea
Well,
as far.
because when you think about it, like the average consumer that goes into a wine store or a liquor store or a convenience store to buy a bottle of wine, right? Like the average cashier is not a sommelier,
Yeah,
right? Nor,
right.
nor that's expecting a lot out of them, right?
Yeah,
For the average some person that's selling over the cashier counter a bottle
yeah,
of wine, right? But the average consumer is educated enough where they can go, I know I'm looking for a Merlot, so I'm going to go
yeah,
to the Merlot section, and
yeah,
among these, I'm going to find the Merlot that I want, right? And maybe if they have a really advanced sommelier type question, maybe there's a sommelier on staff that can answer that question. But for the most part, most consumers know their preference, right? And they know if they're looking for white Zinfandel or Chardonnay, right?
yeah.
And they can kind of
It'll
figure
be
that out, right?
Chardonnay.
Right, because and that's where I think kind of the future of the retail space is. It's like because it's putting too much on the average bud tender to know like such advanced phytochemistry, right? But it's like through this type of a grouping where you have Merlot with Merlot and Chardonnay with Chardonnay and Cabernet Cabernet, and you have a sensory station for the consumer to be able to be like,
Yeah,
oh yeah, this I want to see this and I want to see this, and then you look at that side of the menu, because then from there, like the consumer can do so much of the work on their own to kind of like narrow down the choice, and
yeah,
maybe from there they can also have the bud tender give their own preference note. It's like
yes,
because maybe all the bud tenders there, they're like because this sorting and grouping, it helps to also distance unique user bias, right? Because because like at first when I was participating in the Emerald Cup as a judge, I was kind of just quiet and like paying attention, and I noticed it's the person with the loudest voice on what they thought was fire is who would influence kind of what a winner would be. But
uh,
what I was noticing, I was like, dude, like your picks on this like Girl Scout cookies or Skittles, or that you're pushing is the only thing that's good, I don't even like and wasn't even in my top 10, and so just thinking about the term in terms of like a bud tender, right? Helping a customer, right? It's like what they're pushing, suggestively selling onto people. It's about removing the suggestive sell presenting it in a way that's grouped by
Oh,
aroma,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So that you can kind of have the consumer come to their own epiphany about what smell best affects and associates with them. And then once they're like getting narrowing down options of these like OG Kush, New York Sour Diesel, kind of Gorilla Glue, right? These gassy smells, right? Like whenever a consumer is like narrowing down these 10 choices, maybe then like one of the bud tenders that really loves gas can give some insight into what they think. You know, but yeah, again, it's kind of it's been really amazing for me to see, like, even with the highest level sommelier cannabis people that are judges, to see their own terp light bulb go off. When it's like when you understand, it's like, oh, like when you see things grouped into similar smells, you realize it could be no other way. Because how could you ever like compare Granddaddy Purple versus an OG Kush, right? It's totally different. It's a totally different fruit, and again, comes down to personal preference and bias. But as a judge, to be able to remove your bias and then judge within a class,
yeah,
you can still come to the same conclusion, and that's what's really beautiful to see with the Emerald Cup. It's like there's this, everything's anonymized, but you see this consensus among judges where the terpiest always kind of have a way of rising to the top,
that's so,
indistinguishable from like their own personal choice or preference, and because then you're putting everything on the similar, you're giving everything a similar like shake, or whatever, to where, the cream rises to the top, and then, once everything is ranked, in the tops of each of the smell classes, then there can be the deeper deliberation among judges to kind of be to pick up what the actual overall winner is going to be. But again, just seeing kind of the way that the consensus process happens among judges within the Emerald Cup, and just in my own mind, comparing that to the future experience of a consumer, right? Because I believe that the future educated consumer is kind of like what the Emerald Cup judges, and it's coming to the same thing where you're
yeah,
approaching things, because again, if you have 100 jars with different names and you're just smelling and everything smells all over the place, some like
yeah,
a lot of it doesn't smell at all. Some of it has smells and super sticky. It's like, it's just there's not it's just kind of way disorganized to be able to actually kind of reduce down choices. But whenever they're in similar classes, you
yeah,
can actually judge the uniqueness of a strain amongst peers, right? Where you're like, oh wow, there's some crazy esters in here because it smells so different, than these other ones, and it's sticky and resinous, and you know,
yeah.
so so yeah, anyway, so yeah, I think kind of, the symphony effect, the entourage, right? It's not one compound. It's a cascade of compounds, or I don't know if that's the right word, cascade, but it's this.
It is because the ones that burn off quickly, the ones that don't,
Yeah.
that's with, it's just like this whole,
Hmm.
yeah, I think that is such a cool idea.
Oh, a funny, another funny little thought. So because when we're studying all the Emerald Cup data, year over year, and when we're creating this algorithm to sort all the terpene data by primary compounds, we had a flag for something that didn't organize, because across hundreds of thousands of tests, right? We see that every strain we've ever tested very, organizedly sorts into one of six primary smell groups by their primary and secondary terpene content. And then each primary class has like two, three, four, or more subgroups, right? Sub smells within that class, right? And so whenever we're sorting all this data, we had a flag, like an outlier flag. So anything that didn't really organizedly fit into one of these major classes would get flagged for a secondary review. And that's where I was most excited, because I was like, oh my God, this is where all the land race and really unique exotic smells are going to be. And although there were certain really exotic kind of outlying type profiles, chemistry profiles present, what I learned, what we learned is that a vast majority of the these profiles that were in this outlier flag were the swag terpenes, right? Were the like the indicators of swag. Like, swag? Swag's
Yeah,
like Bammer, or like dog. It's like swag is just like meh. It's like
Oh,
It's not good, right?
okay.
So basically what we saw is like, the thousands of entries that were in this outlier flag were basically what we basically termed this flag we created this. It's called the swag flag, right? The swag flag is the indicator of when everything's gone, right? Like what, the terpenes present after all the other things are gone are what the smell of hay is, right? So the base
Oh, that, yeah,
smell,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
It's where it's like, oh, this is just like, meh. It's weed, but it's like nothing special,
yeah.
and so we see like that, like this, we see this profile, right, present when all the most precious terpenes that are there in highest amounts are gone. What are left are these like bisbolol, neurolidol, guaiol, phytol. There are these terpene compounds that are the highest boiling point compounds. So there are the things that stick around when everything else is gone, right?
Oh,
Right. So the swag flag is
oh,
whenever there's less than 1% terpene content and all the primary terpenes are gone, and the primary terpenes that are present remaining are these higher boiling point terpenes like phytol, neurolidol, guaiol, busbolol, right? That's the indicator of crap, right? That's hay. That's the hay smell, and that's what a lot of herb is by the time it's on shelves, right?
yeah.
Like they because if you have guaiol, phytol, bisbolol, neurolidol as the primary terpenes present, then that's an indicator that all the major aromatics are gone, whether they're the primary terpenes, whether they're the thiols or flavonoids or esters or aldehydes, all that's gone. And the only things that are remaining are these really high boiling point compounds that stick around when everything else is gone, you know?
Oh,
And
yeah,
so yeah, so it's like,
yeah.
it's again,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah, the whole chemistry and the path and everything. It's just so interesting.
I
Yeah,
think it's such critical time in
yeah,
the cannabis industry to kind of help put this information out
yeah,
to raise the awareness, around how we distinguish quality and, what are the things we're actually paying attention to.
yeah, yeah.
Because I think the future, I wrote an article on it. I'll send you. It's about
Okay.
the future of the craft cannabis industry is really, on the line, in how
Oh,
we really define what the quality metrics and how we come to appreciate kind of the preservation side of it, because
oh, great.
terpene preservation is the key to saving the craft cannabis industry,
Yeah,
and it's just about kind of the awareness, making it to the consumer and to the larger buying market before the craft market dies, because after prohibition kind of of alcohol, there was an 80-year consolidation among a few families, before like the craft beer market even started, and you've seen over the last few decades, like the craft market kind of really having this explosive growth. But,
yeah.
with cannabis legalization, and prohibition ending, you have craft and Budweiser sprinting at the same speed, but the market is too immature to even understand what defines craft or quality.
Exactly. And
So
that's what
there's like no space for them to even survive, even though they're the farmers who built this entire movement. And so that's why I think it's so critical on our end as educators, to help kind of make an influence or a difference, in raising the conversation, raising the bar of
yeah,
kind of how we really look at this plant, and what makes it special. It's you can't just deduce it down to, it's this terp or this aromatic, it's so much
yeah.
more of a complex reality. But it's one of my greatest passions, like I
I know.
fancy myself a high level terp nerd, and it's yeah,
I,
just my whole experience kind of is, I feel like we've been on a mission to help like evangelize terpenes and just aromatics and just how, trying to make a difference, right? Because we've seen the way that the markets collapse, market
yeah,
after market, whenever this plant is deduced to this single number,
yeah,
and this is
yeah.
not an active pharmaceutical ingredient, kind
Right.
of Marinol clearly failed, right? Because it was just pure THC, right? And so I think kind of really, everybody that's ever had an intuitive connection to cannabis know how much these aromatics and flavor compounds, are really what define quality. But it's been so, because everybody closest to the plant knows this already. But once
Yeah,
it comes to the buyer out to the consumer, gone, right?
I
It's
know
reduced
that's
to
what,
this number. And so it's like, how do we bridge that gap, to
yeah.
what the ancestral, awareness from people connected closest to this plant have to what the consumer is, ultimately purchasing. So that's just a big, we've been working on, trying to help kind of impart a better understanding for decades, or not decades, but, over a
Yeah.
decade.